When you get rid of sycophants in the military, in the State Department, across the board, then you get rid of the tacit knowledge and the wise decision making that prevents you from getting involved in illegal wars and attacking countries, and you lose the tacit knowledge and wise advice that prevents the mess that the US finds itself in now. And the sycophants create arguments that support one man's choices or one person's choices, and a media architecture ecosystem supports those narratives, and in essence you have an authoritarian government led by, in effect, a dictator. One person's choices determine the path of the nation. There's a narrative that the US doesn't need the Strait of Hormuz, and that if the Europeans want oil, then they can go in and take it. That suggests that the US can remove itself from this situation, which is false. And there are at least two reasons. One is the petrodollar, which was an agreement with the Gulf states that oil would be sold in US dollars in return for security guarantees. If the US departs, those security guarantees no longer seem valid, and that diminishes the reason, the rationale behind the petrodollar. Secondly, if Israel continues to attack Iran and Iran retaliates, then if the US withdraws, Israel will not survive. And so the US has to remain involved for that reason. So there's a narrative that the Europeans can get involved and ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is open, but that is not possible. First of all, this is an illegal war. No matter how the Trump administration tries to spin it, it's an illegal war, and the Europeans don't want to get involved. Had the Trump administration consulted the Europeans, they likely would have suggested that it's a more or less suicidal endeavor. Lots of the US military, State Department, those who haven't been removed, the Trump administration is removing everyone that isn't a sycophant, then also those knowledgeable people within the US would have advised similarly. Thirdly, if European nations did try to guide tankers safely through the Strait of Hormuz, they could be attacked. The Iranian government doesn't actually have to attack them. It could just simply ask them to leave under threat of attacking Gulf countries, military bases in the Gulf countries, oil, hydrocarbon, petroleum, energy facilities within those countries, desalination plants. It could attack potentially Dimona. Signals have been given, which is Israel's nuclear facility, which could create some kind of Chernobyl-like event. It could hit Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. It could hit Israel's energy facilities, and so on. So it could force the Europeans out of the strait simply by making the same sort of threats that they're making against the US and Israel if they continue their attacks. Also, obviously, the Europeans don't want to get involved in a land invasion, boots on the ground, which would involve them getting involved in a decades-long quagmire similar to Iraq. And then finally, the Europeans need energy from the Middle East. They have restricted supply from Russia because they don't want to be dependent on Russia. They're very much reliant on the Americans for energy, but the Trump administration isn't the friendliest. And so by being part of Trump's coalition, for want of a better word, they would be shooting themselves in the foot. So there are lots of reasons why this narrative that the Europeans should have gotten involved is false. And the Europeans can't solve the Strait of Hormuz problem. The US Navy is more powerful than all the European navies put together. And if the US Navy can't solve the problem, so the Europeans can't either. Also, the Iranians don't need to attack European vessels that are guiding tankers through the strait. That would leave them diplomatically isolated and potentially trigger a war with NATO. They would simply need to threaten the Gulf countries and Israel in the same way that they are threatening the US. The US dollar gets stronger as oil prices rise. That's because oil is sold in dollars, and as it becomes more expensive, countries need to access more dollars in order to buy it. So there's a demand on the dollar which causes it to strengthen. This is to do with the petrodollar, an agreement made between the US and Gulf states in the 70s. If the US loses the petrodollar, then that would be catastrophic for the US economy. It would mean that vast amounts of global capital are redirected elsewhere. That would mean less capital invested in the US financial system. That would mean less buying of US treasuries. That would impact the interest rates. That would impact the deficit and the US debt, and the negative impact of that would ripple across the globe. There are a number of strategic reasons why the US and Israel have attacked Iran. Here are 4. Number 1, the petrodollar. If the US can continue to guarantee security in the region, there's greater likelihood that the petrodollar will remain. Number 2, as we know, choking off the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea chokes energy supplies to competitor countries. So by being able to control that supply and control energy supply to countries, it can control their economic development. For example, the economic development of China. Number 3, China has various road initiatives that allow it to transport goods across land through Iran as opposed to via sea routes, and that could then be disrupted, again containing China. Number 4, Israel has ambitions to be the regional hegemon, Greater Israel, and defeating Iran, causing Iran to become a failed state would facilitate that. One advantage for Israel, were it to become the regional hegemon, is that it could redirect oil supplies through it. In other words, the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz would not become the choke points. Israel would become the choke point, and Israel would have control. So this poses a little bit of a conspiracy theory, but given what the CIA and Mossad get up to, I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility. The only publicly available evidence I have is that Netanyahu himself has stated that he would like Middle Eastern oil, petrochemicals, hydrocarbons and so on to flow, to transit through Israel. In order to do that, he would need to encourage conflict in the other transit routes. In other words, conflict in the Red Sea and through the Strait of Hormuz. He would also need to persuade the Gulf countries to build pipelines through Israel, which he could do if surrounding countries were failed states and Israel became the regional hegemon. Ultimately, it would come down to insurance. It would need to be cheaper to insure oil transiting through Israel than it would be to insure it transiting through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. The benefit for Israel obviously would be that it would become the choke point. It would be able to control energy supplies to the rest of the world from the Middle East, and therefore encourage or inhibit their economic growth. In In other words, Israel would be able to weaponize energy in the same way that Trump is weaponizing tariffs, threatening to withdraw from NATO, and so on.